When I saw the job posting for a babysitter needed at a large old house on the edge of town, I jumped at the opportunity. As a broke college student, I needed the money and I loved kids, so it seemed like the perfect gig. I drove out to the address, an imposing Victorian mansion that looked like it had been plucked straight from a horror movie. Shrugging off my uneasy, I walked up the creaky front steps and rang the bell. A kindly older woman answered and introduced herself as Mrs. Abrams. She welcomed me inside, where I met her husband and their young daughter Lily, a shy 5-year-old with big blue eyes. They gave me a quick tour of the sprawling house and its dusty, ornate rooms. I tried not to stare at the heavy antique furniture, somber oil paintings, and intricate carved moldings that screamed old money. Mrs. Abrams showed me Lily's room, a bright space filled with toys and stuffed animals. At least someone lived in this relic. After going over Lily's routine and bedtime, the Abrams said their goodbyes and headed off to their dinner engagement, leaving me alone with Lily. We played together for hours, reading stories, coloring, and playing make-believe. Lily opened up, her initial shyness fading away. As her bedtime neared, I could tell she was getting tired. Her head would droop and her eyes flutter closed before she'd force them open again. I tucked her in with her favorite stuffed bear and sat in a chair beside the bed as she drifted off to sleep. The old house seemed to shift and settle around us, floorboards creaking, pipes rattling. I tried to ignore the ominous noises. I pulled out my textbook to study, but I couldn't focus. The hair on the back of my neck prickled like I was being watched. Glancing up from my book, my breath caught in my throat. Outside the window, a shadowy figure stood motionless, staring right at me. Terror seized me. I sat paralyzed, heartbeat thundering in my ears. The shadow drew closer to the glass, features obscured in darkness. It raised one long, thin arm and pointed directly at me. Gasping, I jumped up, clutching Lily to my chest and shaking her awake. "We have to get out of here," I whispered urgently. Still half asleep, she nodded as I carried her down the stairs. I fumbled with the locks, the front door finally swinging open. Lily buried her head in my shoulder and squeezed her eyes shut as we hurried to my car. I buckled Lily into the back seat and peeled out of the winding driveway. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Lily cried quietly. "It's okay, we're safe now," I soothed, even as my heart continued to thunder. I drove aimlessly, not wanting to take Lily back to that house of horrors. After an hour, her crying ceased, exhaustion overtaking her. My adrenaline rush seeped away too as we put more distance between us and the mansion. Surely I had imagined that shadowy specter. Old houses play tricks on your mind. I called the Abrams to let them know we had left. They were confused, then angry. I tried to explain calmly, but they accused me of scaring their child. They refused to pay me and slammed the phone down. Unease gnawed at me. I couldn't get the image of that ominous shadow figure out of my head. Over the next few days, I drove by the manor, hoping to catch a glimpse of the family, to know they were all right. But the house remained still and silent. I asked neighbors if they knew the Abrams. They gave me puzzled looks, insisting no one had lived in that abandoned property for years. Dread filled me. Had I imagined the whole thing? Plagued by nightmares, I contacted a paranormal investigator. We returned to the mansion armed with detection equipment. The investigator scoured the premises, finding cold spots and high EMF readings, indicators of ghostly activity. A handheld recorder picked up creepy whispers when no one was there. In the basement, we discovered a small hidden room. Dusty shelves lined the walls filled with melted candles, symbols etched into the concrete floor. The investigator paled. "Some kind of ritual took place here," he muttered. My stomach turned. What had I stumbled into? As I stepped into the room, vivid images flashed through my mind. A dark, robed figure chanting Little Lily crying on a stone altar, a glint of metal raised high over the shadowy form. I swayed on my feet. The investigator grabbed my arm to steady me, his eyes wide. "Are you okay?" I shook my head, the awful vision still imprinted behind my eyes. "We have to find out what happened to that family." The investigator agreed to help me dig deeper. After days of research, We pieced together the property's disturbing history, tales of cult activity, children vanishing, sacrifices to a pagan god. My blood ran cold. I realized I had to return, to try to release Lily's spirit from that evil place. The investigator refused to go back, but I had to face my fear. I crept inside the silent house once more, every shadow enveloping me in icy dread. "Lily," I called out softly. "I'm here to help you." A childish giggle echoed through the empty rooms. I followed the playful sounds down to the basement. At the doorway to the ritual room, I hesitated. "You don't have to stay here. You can be free." A figure began to materialize before my eyes, little Lily clutching her stuffed bear. She reached for my hand. As our fingers touched, a feeling of peace washed over me. Holding tight to the child spirit, I walked with her into the light, leaving the darkness behind. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I pushed my cart down the empty aisles. It was 9:55 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and the Walmart had just announced it would be closing in 5 minutes. As a stalker on the overnight shift, I was used to being one of the last people out of the massive store. I maneuvered my cart into the toy section and began straightening up the plushies and board games. Most of the other employees had already clocked out for the night. The only other people left were a couple of teenage cashiers giggling at the registers, and Hank, the elderly greeter by the entrance. I was focused on organizing a jumbled pile of stuffed animals when a bright peal of laughter rang out from the next aisle over. I froze, my fingers clenching around a fluffy brown teddy bear. The innocent giggle echoed again, definitely belonging to a young child. Strange. I hadn't seen any kids in the store, especially not this late at night. I was tempted to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. Abandoning my cart, I crept toward the source of the laughter. "Hello?" I called out softly. "Is anyone there?" My voice was swallowed up by the cavernous ceilings as I scanned the empty aisle. A chill ran down my spine. I knew for certain there were no kids left in the store at this hour. I took a few steps forward, peering around a towering display of Lego sets. That's when I saw her. At the far end of the aisle stood a young girl who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. Her back was to me, blonde curls tumbling over an outdated floral dress. I approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "Hey, are you lost?" I asked gently. "The store is closing soon. We need to find your parents." She didn't respond. I quickened my pace until I was right behind her. I reached out and put a hand on her bony shoulder. "Sweetie, let me help." I recoiled in shock and horror. My hand had passed right through her. As soon as I touched her, her body dissipated into gray wisps of smoke before reforming. She slowly turned her head 180 degrees to face me, her neck crackling sickeningly. Instead of eyes, 2 black empty voids stared back at me. I stumbled backwards with a strangled gasp. The lights overhead surged violently, then exploded in a shower of glass. The child's mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing a dark abyss behind her pink lips. Her ghostly form rushed towards me, hands outstretched and grasping. I spun on my heel and sprinted for the nearest exit, weaving through the dim aisles. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had to get out of this place. The remainder of the lights blew out in succession as I ran by them, casting the store into darkness. I was almost to the front when I collided with something solid in my path, but there was nothing there. An invisible force slammed into my chest, knocking the wind from my lungs and throwing me to the floor. Gasping, I looked up to see the faint outline of a man materialize in front of me. He was tall and angry, with hollow eyes and a sneer that chilled me to my core. The ghostly man opened his mouth in a silent scream, just like the girl had. A wave of Arctic air blasted over me, freezing me in place. I was paralyzed by fear and cold, pinned helplessly beneath the shadowy specter, his translucent hands wrapped around my neck, cutting off my airway. I struggled feebly against the crushing grip, watching as he slowly materialized into a solid form. My vision started to dim. This was it. I was going to die here on this dirty linoleum floor, choked to death by a vengeful spirit. With my last ounce of strength, I croaked out a final plea for help. Suddenly, the pressure on my throat eased up. I gulped down air and wildly looked around. The ghosts had vanished. The overhead lights flickered back on, revealing Hank standing over me, his hands still gripping the ghost's wrists. "You all right there?" Hank asked in his gravelly voice. I just nodded, unable to form words yet. The ghosts were gone, but they had left me shaken to my core. I never returned to that Walmart again. I know those spirits are still there, lurking in the aisles, waiting for their next victim. I won't let it be me. The pounding on the door startled me awake. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing. Beside me, my wife stirred. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. The pounding came again, louder this time. Thump, thump, thump. I glanced at the bedside clock. 3:01 a.m. on the dot, just like every night this week. Swallowing hard, I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, dimly lit sconces casting creepy shadows on the ornate carpet. Taking a deep breath, I cracked the door open. "Hello?" Silence. The hairs on my arms stood at attention. I slammed the door shut and slid the deadbolt into place. When I turned around, my wife was sitting up in bed, blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. "What was that?" Her eyes were wide. "Nothing," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Go back to sleep." I climbed into bed beside her, but sleep did not return easily. This place gave me the creeps from the moment we arrived. The staff walked around with hollow stares, barely acknowledging us. Strange symbols were etched into the very walls, though the concierge insisted they were simply Moroccan designs. Yet somehow, my wife and I found ourselves confined here night after night. Earlier today, after finding her missing jewelry tucked away in her purse, my wife had insisted we leave right away. I readily agreed. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine barely sputtered. I popped the hood to find the battery was dead, completely drained. When I went to call the front desk, the phone was dead too. No dial tone, no signal. We were well and truly stuck. As I lay in bed now, listening to my wife's breathing slow into sleep, I racked my brain for a way out. There had to be something I was missing, some logical explanation. A skittering sound like fingernails on glass made me bolt upright again. It was coming from inside the room. I leapt out of bed, flicked on the lights, and searched every inch of the room. Under the bed, inside the closet, behind the drapes. Nothing. Heart pounding, I turned the lights back off and crawled into bed. But sleep did not come again that night. The next day, I scoured the hotel for answers, searching for anyone who would make eye contact. The staff averted their gazes and slipped into side rooms as I approached. Finally, I cornered the concierge. "What is going on here?" I demanded. "The knocking, the noises." He avoided my stare. "It is nothing, sir. Just the charms of an old building." I grabbed his arm. "I don't believe you. We're leaving today." The concierge's eyes widened slightly. "As you wish, sir." I felt a small surge of victory as I went to gather our suitcases. But when I turned the key in the ignition again, the car only wheezed weakly. We were still trapped. That night, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. I covered my ears with a pillow, unable to block it out. Beside me, my wife whispered, "What do they want from us?" I had no answer. The next morning, I tore through the hotel lobby like a madman, throwing chairs, smashing vases, searching for answers. The staff watched impassively until security dragged me away. Defeated, I returned to the room. My wife sat on the bed, face pale. "We have to get out of here," she choked. But I knew escape was impossible. I realized then that this hotel was not just haunted, it was cursed. We were being punished for encroaching on something ancient and malevolent. The staff were helpless against its power. That night, as the pounding on the door grew deafening, we huddled together in bed, shivering uncontrollably. The air had grown heavy, oppressive. Our breath came in ragged gasps. Something sinister lurked outside that door, growing stronger as it fed on our terror. Summoning my last reserves of courage, I leapt from bed and began piling furniture against the door. My wife helped wordlessly. We worked through the night, voices hoarse from chanting prayers, fingers bloody from hammering chairs and table legs. As dawn's light crept in, we collapsed on the bed, not knowing what we had kept at bay. On the third day, I found a local spiritualist to cleanse our room. As she lit candles and chanted ancient words, the heavy air cleared. Light shone through the windows once again. We left that day unhindered, the car roaring to life. But we will never forget the evil that dwelled within those walls. It has left a stain on our souls, a shadow behind our eyes. We avoided hotels after that night, and confined spaces, dark spaces, silences, for the knocking never leaves. It echoes eternally in the deepest recesses of our minds, a reminder of what we experienced in that cursed hotel, and of what we barely escaped.